Millions of people over 50 are currently living through the end of a long marriage. Many of them describe the same experience, a disorientation they weren't prepared for, not just the pain of separation, but something deeper, a loss of structure, of routine, of a sense of self that had been built over decades. What this video examines is why that happens and what the research tells us about the psychological weight of ending a long-term marriage later in life. For decades, researchers tracked a demographic shift that moved largely without public attention. While divorce rates among younger adults were declining, the opposite was happening among people over 50. In 1990, fewer than 1 in 10 people going through a divorce were aged 50 or older. By 2019, that figure had reached 36%. For adults over 65, the divorce rate has tripled since 1990. Researchers at Bowling Green State University formally documented this pattern in a landmark study. They named it the Gray Divorce Revolution, a term that reflected not just a statistical trend, but a structural shift in how people in the second half of life were navigating long-term relationships. The same pattern was documented across Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, and much of Europe. This was not an isolated development within one country or culture. The numbers establish the scale. They do not explain what the experience involves. When a marriage ends after 20 or 30 years, there is a common assumption that the level of pain will correspond to how troubled the relationship had become. Research does not support that assumption. Even among those who describe relief at leaving an unfulfilling marriage, the psychological impact tends to be significant and often surprising in its intensity. The reason is structural. A long marriage is not simply a relationship, it is an organizing framework for daily life. It contains shared routines, a social network, a sense of physical home, long-range plans, and a role that has shaped how a person understands themselves in the world. When the marriage ends, all of those elements are disrupted simultaneously. Psychologists who study this process describe the resulting experience as a form of grief, specifically what the research calls disenfranchised grief. The term refers to mourning that is real and significant but receives limited social recognition. Death is met with established rituals and formal acknowledgement. Divorce, by contrast, is often met with expectations of practicality and forward movement. The grief that accompanies the end of a long-term marriage, grief for a shared history, for an imagined future, for an identity constructed within that partnership, frequently goes unacknowledged by the social environment surrounding the person experiencing it. Among the consequences that researchers consistently identify as underestimated is the impact on personal identity. For many people in long marriages, the sense of self becomes structurally tied to the role of spouse. That role shapes self-perception, social positioning, and the way a person moves through daily life. When the marriage ends, the role ends with it, and many individuals report a disorienting uncertainty about who they are outside of it. Research published in the Journal of Marriage and Family found that individuals who divorce after 50 tend to show more severe symptoms of depression than those who divorce at younger ages. Part of this reflects a difference in available resources. Older adults often have greater financial resources than younger divorcing adults, but they tend to have smaller and less adaptable social networks. The relationships built during a long marriage are frequently couple-centered. They belong to the partnership as much as to the individual, and rebuilding an independent social life later in adulthood is significantly more difficult. Researchers also describe a psychological dynamic they call future time perspective. This refers to the perception of how much time remains, and how that perception shapes emotional response. When a marriage ends at 32, the sense of available future is expansive. When it ends at 54 or 62, that perception contracts, and the contraction itself becomes a source of anxiety. Research indicates that when older adults perceive their remaining time as limited, they are more likely to experience heightened stress and to prioritize immediate emotional experience over longer-term adjustment and rebuilding. If you're finding this content useful, taking a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel helps us continue covering these topics with the depth they deserve. Research also identifies meaningful differences in how gray divorce is experienced depending on the individual's role in the decision. For those who initiated the separation, the psychological experience commonly involves a combination of relief and guilt. Relief at leaving a relationship that had become unfulfilling, alongside guilt about the consequences of that decision for the other person. Research also documents an element that initiators frequently report not anticipating: grief. Grief for the years of the marriage, for the person their spouse had once been, and for the version of the future they had originally married toward. For those who did not initiate the divorce, or who recognized signs but could not accept their implications, the experience follows a different pattern. Research describes the sudden loss of a long-term attachment as capable of triggering responses that parallel trauma: a collapse of psychological ground, rapid uncertainty about the future, and a form of betrayal that extends beyond trust in the other person to a loss of confidence in the shared narrative of one's own life. The psychological literature does not rank these experiences by severity. They represent different forms of disruption with different timelines and different challenges. Jacques Guyon research has consistently identified men as carrying specific vulnerabilities in the context of gray divorce. Studies show that men in long marriages typically rely on their spouse as their primary emotional support. Male social networks, both before and during marriage, tend to be smaller and less emotionally intimate than those of women. When the marriage ends, many men find themselves without an adequate support structure. Research has suggested that gray divorce increases mortality risk more significantly for men than for women, a finding that reflects the documented physical consequences of sustained emotional isolation, including effects on immune function, sleep, and the progression of depression. A study using data from the Netherlands found that individuals who divorced at midlife and later showed significantly higher levels of emotional loneliness than those who remained continuously married, and that this held regardless of whether they subsequently remarried. The loneliness documented was not simply the result of being without a partner. It was tied to the loss of a particular form of intimacy, the kind that develops over decades of shared experience and is not easily reconstructed. Gray divorce also carries consequences for adult children, a dimension of the experience that receives comparatively little attention in public discussion, but is well documented in the research. When parents of minor children divorce, legal structures provide a framework: custody arrangements, defined schedules, formal roles. When parents divorce after their children are grown, no equivalent framework exists. Adult children are left to process the end of their parents' marriage without external guidance, and research indicates that many find this genuinely destabilizing. Studies on adult children of gray divorce have documented questions about personal identity, relationship attitudes, and family stability. Some report feeling pressure to align with one parent over the other. Some reduce contact with one or both parents as a way of managing the emotional impact. That withdrawal, in turn, can intensify the isolation experienced by the divorcing individuals themselves. The end of a long-term marriage affects the family system well beyond the two people at its center. Longitudinal research tracking individuals through gray divorce does document evidence of personal growth over time, though the timelines and trajectories vary considerably. A Swiss longitudinal study that followed more than 500 individuals through the dissolution of long-term marriages of at least 15 years found that both men and women showed measurable personal growth following gray divorce. Women showed higher levels of personal growth across the entire observation period. Men's trajectories were similar in direction, but more gradual in pace. In both cases, a consistent predictor of better outcomes was the quality and presence of social support. Individuals who had strong, engaged social networks navigated the process more effectively than those who were more isolated. Therapy appears across multiple studies as a meaningful resource in this process, not as a mechanism for eliminating grief, but as a structured space for processing it, for reconstructing identity after years of being defined by a partnership role, and for developing a functional orientation toward the future. Gray divorce is a documented and growing phenomenon that carries significant psychological weight, weight that is proportional not to the quality of the marriage that ended, but to the depth and duration of the life built within it. The research establishes that the grief is real, that the identity disruption is real, that the social and emotional risks, particularly for men, are real. It also establishes that outcomes vary, that social connection matters, and that the period following a long marriage's dissolution, while genuinely difficult, does not follow a single fixed trajectory. The experience affects not just the individuals who divorce, but their adult children and broader family systems. It is occurring across multiple countries and cultures, and at a scale that continues to grow. For those living through it, the research offers neither easy answers nor false reassurance. What it does offer is context, a clearer understanding of why this particular form of loss carries the weight that it does, and what the evidence shows about the factors that shape what comes after. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what you or someone you know is going through, subscribe to this channel. We cover the psychology and human experience behind major life transitions, with depth and without shortcuts. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are in this process. Your experience matters, and others going through the same thing are reading those comments. In the next video, we look at something the research raises directly: why emotional loneliness after gray divorce is different from simply being alone, and what that distinction means for the people living with it.